Hello, everyone. I'm Jane Ward, president of Friends of the Edgewater Library, and also co-chair along with Michelle Allen of the group's programming committee. Welcome to tonight's program, The Fight, Might, and Right to Vote, Then and Now. We bring this to you in partnership with the Edgewater Branch Library, and this is a three-part evening consisting of a play, a voting rights discussion, and a question and answer period. We want the evening to run smoothly. So to that end, let me quickly just run through some procedure and then we'll move right into the introduction. In a couple of minutes, the only people on screen will be the actors presenting tonight's play. At the start of the program, Friends of the Edgewater Library muted your video and audio. This courtesy eliminates interruptions to our speakers. Please do not try to unmute yourselves. We will unmute you when it is appropriate to do so at the end of the program. We will also be recording this program for playback on the Friends website. By registering, you've given the Friends of the Edgewater Library permission to use your image and voice when applicable as a part of that recording and its future use online. As I said, there will be a question and answer period at the end of the talk, so please open your chat box and type your questions there at any time during the performance and address them to the Friends of the Edgewater Library hosts and hit enter to send. During the Q&A period, I will be asking the questions on your behalf. However, once the program is ended, we'll unmute you all so you can chat directly with tonight's guests for a few minutes. And this is your chance to ask any last-minute questions. So please hang on to Zoom after the Q&A period wraps up. Now on to our introductions. Tonight, we're really pleased to have with us Mary Bonnett, Artistic Director of Her Story Theater, bringing you her short play, Radical Ideas, Women, and the Vote, which follows the journey of three Illinois suffragettes, Grace Wilbur Trout, Ida B. Wells, and Catherine McCullough, who fought for the vote and the ratification of the 19th Amendment in Illinois. We also have a gentleman actor who's playing several roles tonight. You'll see him listed there as males pro and con. And I will introduce the performers in just a second. Mary, Her Story Theater is a Chicago theater company for social change. Its mission to shine bright lights in dark places on women and children in need of social justice and community support. Mary is the creator and the co-founder. She's a prolific playwright and she speaks regularly at events across the nation on domestic sex trafficking and its impact on youth. The performers she brings with her tonight are Brigid Duffy as Catherine McCullough, Connie Foster as Grace Wilbur Trout, Alma Washington as Ida B. Wells, and Gary Houston, as I said, representing several men of the time, both anti-19th Amendment and supporters of. Joining Mary in discussion for the second part of the evening is Anne Jamieson, president of the League of Women Voters of Chicago, and she's here to remind us that the fight for the right to vote continues today. Mary and company, welcome. I turn this first part of the evening over to you.
Thank you, Jane. What a lovely introduction. And thank you all for joining us. And thank you to Friends of the Library Edgewater for having us. We're very excited to be here. We will start. I will introduce the title of this piece again, and please enjoy. Radical Ideas, Women in the Vote.
A summer day on June 17th, 1913, sitting outside a congressional door in Springfield, Illinois, all the blood, sweat, and tears of that battle ended with a simple I.
Pardon my French, but it took 72 damn years to open that door.
From the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848, when the vote amendment was first introduced to Congress, to August 18, 1920, when the women's vote was ratified by Congress.
Before women got the vote, 18 male U.S. presidents came and went, including Lincoln.
The Mexican-American War, U.S. Civil War, Spanish-American War, and World War I were all fought and won.
Slavery was abolished, and Black men won their right to vote.
Sewing machines, the bra, dishwashers, lie detectors, washing machines, telephones were all invented before women got the vote.
A married woman had no jurisdiction over her own children. She could not claim her own wardrobe.
About all a woman had was her soul, and we men usually laid claim to that. Also, we considered male children more vote-worthy.
We women had our own internal struggles. Not all of us marched to the same drum.
Not all of us wanted a sister in the front of the parade marching to that drum.
Radical ideas, demanding equality, demanding the right to vote, demanding protection under the law. Anarchists, all of us.
Anarchists indeed. The United States Constitution made it perfectly clear women and idiots could not vote for a reason.
And there were some women's idiotic ideas that almost sank us.
Like Chicago homemaker Carolyn Fairfield Corbin, who founded the Illinois Association opposed to the extension of suffrage to women. She chatted away like she was bought and paid for by the Illinois House of Representatives.
She is quoted as saying, well, actually, I heard her say it. And
I believe women should stay in their sphere of home life and allow their husbands and fathers to legislate for their protection. Women's suffrage is akin to socialism. I loathe both. Every time a suffragist tries to advance, myself and my organization will push them back.
Spoken like a true American, a uniter, not a divider like Trout, Wells, and McCullough.
Which leads us to our own issues. The three of us were as diverse in our approaches and leadership styles as we were in our fashion sense.
Our coming together was complicated, contrary, messy, yet necessary. For once united, we were a force to be reckoned with.
I talked softly and carried a political bat.
I carried a real bat and hit things with it.
I used the bat to get me to the front of the line, though never intending to use it except on my opponents.
And oddly, all of us had never heard the word no.
We were told no often, but somehow never understood those two little letters when put together.
No, 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 no. Women's suffrage increases taxes. Women's suffrage causes divorces. Women's suffrage destroys families. Women's suffrage is a joint plot of the anarchist industrial workers of the world, socialists and Mormons.
Oh, speaking of which, buy my book, A Mormon Wife.
Please, this suffrage movement is a costly and dangerous experiment, one this country can't afford.
We ignored them. My game plan was more heads on. Let's hit those politicians where they work. As a lawyer, I knew the law backwards and forwards. I knew that women had no laws to protect them. I wanted full coverage, not just the vote. I wanted divorce laws changed, workers' rights resolved, health issues raised and dealt with.
I focused exclusively on achieving woman suffrage.
Key word, exclusive. Mrs. Trout's campaign went white only.
A political tactic.
A racist ploy.
A mistake for which I am deeply sorry.
They were sorry. They needed the Black woman's support and eventually saw the benefits. Eventually.
Gloves off. I'm Catherine McCullough, mother of 4, graduate from the Chicago Union College of Law, a partner in a firm with my husband, and fought like hell for prohibition. No ladylike tactics for me.
Grace Wilbur Trout, my pleasure as always. Privately educated, a woman of rank in my community, well taken care of by my husband. Blessed with a beautiful home and garden in Oak Park, a noted novelist and thriving career on a lecture circuit.
Ida B. Wells, slave, freed, schooled. Parents died of yellow fever, cared for siblings, taught, attended Fisk University. Journalist with a cause after being kicked off the train for refusing to ride in the Negro car. Watched my people lynched, had my life threatened, but kept writing. It was better to die fighting injustice than just die. I used that mighty pen to smote my enemies.
My husband and I monitored the Illinois state legislature, worked to raise their consciousness about the issues of suffrage, and lobbied to have suffrage bills introduced. I finally realized the legislature had no conscience or consciousness, So when elected president of the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association, I started banging pots in their ears just to get their attention, to wake them up. I also threw banners from the Illinois State House Gallery, which fluttered right above the legislative heads. It caused grand annoyance in those very cramped chambers. Gentlemen, we women will not be ignored.
No, they'll be outsmarted. In retaliation for that circus, we, the all-male Senate, brought in the women to testify about why they deserve the vote. We let them sing their little patriotic songs, and while they were gleefully humming away, we slipped out of the chamber and secretly voted to postpone their recommendation. Ladies, let it be a lesson on where the real power lies.
Women at the time could neither vote nor address the legislature unless invited. So we brought our concerns before the lawmakers by presenting petitions signed by our constituents.
Since no one would look at them, I decided to paste our suffrage petitions on muslin cloth and drape them from the House galleries down through the House aisles. The train of signatures reached 75 yards. It was most impressive.
Petitions aside, the real problem was getting a bill introduced.
First, we had to find a sympathetic legislator who would agree to sponsor the measure. We found Homer Tice.
He supported the damn thing, and it was political suicide. He became so unpopular.
Every bill I introduced after that got killed. And I told McCullough Dame to tone it down and reach out to the hearts and conscience of men.
I told him next time the message would be delivered by monkeys in tutus. They get more respect.
Try as she might, and Catherine tried. The game was fixed, according to Illinois State Representative George Fitch.
Oh, there are so many ways of defeating bills in the legislature. Voting against them as a last resort. In all the years in which the suffrage bill went before the Illinois House of Representatives, it somehow got into the wrong committee and died. Or it was amended to death on the second reading, or it got to the third reading and perished there at the close of the session, or perished twice on the third reading, despite the fact that petitions had been presented to the Speaker, signed by 80 members, and asking that it be brought to a vote. For at the same time, more than 80 members had privately asked the same Speaker not to let the bill come to a vote. And that's how it's done.
My last year as president, I took a train down to Springfield, armed with over 200 people, and we made a terrible noise. They heard us. I know they heard us.
Heard with little or no impact on anything but the birds flying overhead, my dear Miss McCullough.
Times changed. Out with the old, on with the new. Along came Mrs. Grace Wilbur Trout in all her refinement, money, and charm, and an oh so different approach than Catherine's. We moved from confrontation to cooperation, intimidation to persuasion. In 1912, Mrs. Trout was elected president of the Chicago Political Equality League,
of which I was a founding member.
And then there was me, battling anti-lynching, anti-everything Negro. I was a journalist, activist, eventually researcher. I fought sexism, racism, and violence. It was an ugly time for my people. I was burned out, beaten out, and threatened out of my work, which forced me to move to Chicago, where I met my lawyer for a husband, the famed Ferdinand Bonnett, and together we raised 4 children. But if white women had their way, I would be back in the kitchen. I wasn't going anywhere except forward.
The Southern white women wanted no part of Ida's kind.
Even though my name isn't recognized, I was the founder of the National Association of Colored Women, also the Alpha Suffrage Club. So what do civil rights and women's suffrage have in common? Me, because ain't I a woman? What a stir my club made.
Oh, it did cause a stir. And yet I can assure you that it isn't a bad thing to know the affluent and influential, which I did, and use to full advantage to sway the vote. The 19th Century Club, very progressive. We adopted a resolution in favor of full suffrage, and I made many friends, especially men who supported the temperance or prohibition ticket as we did, like Edward Fitzsimmons Dunn.
Well, I was a dear friend of Grace, and remarkably was governor of Illinois when the suffrage bill passed. And she and her die-hard crew of women made me a believer. Suffrage was the right way to go. I was the one who, as governor, signed the landmark bill.
So ladies, it's not what you know, but who you know. And influential women know their influential husbands quite well. And fortunately, I knew those influential women.
Grace believed one gets more bees in honey than vinegar.
Grace dripped in honey.
My plan was to appeal to the kindness of husbands and the logic of women. Once president of the Chicago Political Equality League, I deliberately made friends with the mayor of Chicago, Fred Bussey.
Well, she did, and it was an honor. The lovely woman. I allowed the ladies into the 4th of July parade. Why not? Well, as long as you pay for the float.
And it was a stunning, gigantic float, decorated with daughters of dear friends.
Oh, suffice it to say, Grace knew people.
And she cozied up to millionaire John Farros with her tour idea.
As president of the Chicago Automobile Club and the American Automobile Association, Mrs. Trout also won my vote. With her charm, I backed the suffrage movement 100%. In fact, gave her the automobiles to use in her automobile suffrage campaign.
On the road, young women, suburbanites, city women, and men who loved automobiles came to hear our speeches. It was harmless yet effective, with a banner that simply read, "Vote for Women."
Proudly, I must say, the tour became a national sensation and success. Often 2,000 people or more attended her auto rallies.
And when wealthy North Shore suburbanites finally supported suffrage, and 64 mayors put their statements of support on our pamphlets, things moved quickly. So now, as president of the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association, I was off to Springfield.
In lieu of banners and attacks on the representatives,
I conducted a quiet educational campaign, turning enemies into friends.
It made me sick. I had worked my behind off all those years from the legal aspect, and she trots in, wooing and dining the very people who had scorned and ridiculed it. If she succeeds in this mealy-mouthed, conciliatory approach, it could be adopted at the national level. It was a bitter pill.
But you swallowed it and did the right thing, as we all had to do.
I hid it under my tongue.
The National Parade, March 3rd, 1913. 5,000 suffragists marched in Washington, D.C. 83 women from Illinois riding the suffrage train, and one of them was me, Ida B. Wells, representing my people, the Alpha Suffrage Club. My people looking to the vote to help end our sexual exploitation, provide educational opportunities, and protect our wage earners.
The parade plans were glorious. We all wore uniforms with white broadcloth caps, long stoles, and pennants bearing the inscription Illinois in blue letters, surrounded by 9 stars to represent the 9 states where women's suffrage had been attained.
This regalia with the gold braid trim and tassels gave a military appearance to the women, which was heightened by their march and drill.
I carried the American flag.
And a young woman rode a beautiful spirited horse on the outside of the flank. All was thrilling until...
Alice Stone Blackwell here. My dear Grace, if you think colored women are going to march side by side with my white Southern women? You must be out of your Midwest mind. Rid of her and we stay. Don't and we go. Simple as that.
Oh, I must say, it was not a proud moment in my life, but I did it for the cause. We all did it for the cause. Ida, I'm asking you to march at the end of the procession rather than creating an embarrassing scene that will undermine our efforts. We cannot afford to lose all these supporters. I beg you, with my sincere apologies, go to the back with your people.
Who did she think she was talking to? Miss Alice Stone Blackwell's maid? I turned to that dear woman and said, if the Illinois women do not take a stand now in the great Democratic parade, then the colored women are lost.
So Ida, just between you and me, I cannot be accountable or responsible or stop other people's behavior. I hope I've made myself clear.
I believe you have, Grace. To those Southern women, I took that bitter pill, hid it under my tongue like Catherine, and watched the parade go by. But as soon as that Illinois delegation came up, I stepped forward and took my rightful place in front of the line, flanked by Belle Squire and Virginia Brooks, and we marched.
I knew she was there. I heard the gasp. I kept my head high, waved that flag, and never looked back. Illinois represented all women that day.
And we represented all men that day. Drunk and loud, we beat, spit, jeered, slapped, tripped, and shouted humiliating chants along with those singular words that cut to the fiber of a female's dignity. And we sent hundreds to the hospital. And the other thousands went home bruised and battered. Well, those dames deserved it.
2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Then there was the Catherine problem.
Yeah, she nearly sabotaged the whole campaign in Springfield.
I called for a suffrage amendment. Sue me.
The amendment would not only be defeated, but would alienate many politicians. The problem? The Illinois Constitution only allowed 1 amendment to be introduced per year regarding women and the vote. And voters are defined as men.
My amendment focused only on municipal and presidential elections, not the state. By introducing her amendment, ours would be thrown out. We asked her to withdraw it.
No, don't do this to me. I'd be throwing away 20 years of my life's work.
Catherine's bill died in committee, which finally and sadly forced her to
swallow.
Oh, thank God, the suffrage bill did not die.
Moving forward, June 17, 1913.
I sat outside the door of the House chambers, urging members to vote in favor and trying desperately to prevent the anti-lobbyists from illegally being allowed onto the House floor.
As if we were going to tolerate her. As Dorman and I said, you go sit in the gallery with the rest of the skirts. If not, I'll call the police and let them drag you out by the hair. Well, she didn't buy it, and well, she didn't budge.
Yeah, for 3 hours, I blocked everyone coming and going until 77 votes were cast in our favor. We won that vote that day in Illinois. I nearly fainted.
Illinois women could vote for presidential electors, including me.
The headline read, "The effect of this victory upon the nation was astounding," and it was.
1916, with momentum and the wind of victory at our backs, we marched on the Republican National Convention in Chicago.
We Illinois suffragettes convinced the presidential candidate to endorse the proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Grown men wept.
1919. The 19th Amendment passes and goes to the states for ratification. The headlines read, Illinois approves, the country follows.
And grown men wept and decried, doomed. Inmates running the asylum.
On June 10th, 1919, Illinois became the first state to approve the 19th Amendment.
And August 26th, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution took effect. Just 2 long sentences.
And blessedly, miraculously, on that day, all women could vote.
We stood united, grasped each other's hands, and cried, hoping that those who had gone before us heard our voices from above.
To you, Abigail Adams, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth,
Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone.
And all the tireless women who fought and suffered for what was deservedly and rightfully theirs.
What you started is finally finished.
My dears, the ladies were remembered.
Now, the fight begins for equal rights.
For civil rights.
For the future. And a woman for president.
End of play.
Thank you very much, everyone. Wow, that was a really powerful and ultimately uplifting performance. And on that note, audience, we're going to mute the performers and move into the second portion of the evening. And Mary Bonnett, thank you for continuing to stay with us for the second part. Anne Jamieson is joining us from the president of the League of Women Voters of Chicago. We are going to see, just bring these 2 women up on the screen. All right, great. All right, ladies. Mary, this is a very powerful piece of theater. Can you tell us what compelled you to write about these women?
Well, as you can see, it's a remarkable history, isn't it? And these were just 3 women, you know, just 3 women from Illinois. And this was going on all across the country with these amazing women who would not give up, who were such fighters, who sacrificed so much. Many sacrificed their lives. And it started much earlier. You know, it started with Abigail Adams with Remember the Ladies. You know, way back then, asking her husband, John Adams, don't forget about us, you know, and he did. I think he did forget about us. So they had to go back and fight. And then you've got little women like Alice Paul coming in, and she went to jail. She starved herself. They force-fed her, with this hard tube down her throat. Those women got arrested and had to, I think there's a 6-week period for some, a 1-week period for others. They slept in bed bugs. They were deprived of fresh air. It was horrible conditions. And this went on and on and on. They were mocked, just as that one man spoke about all the things that were done to them in the 1913 parade. That went on forever with men. And at the time, women had no rights whatsoever. They could be, prior to that, they could be beaten by their husband based on the rule of thumb, which is the stick, the size or the diameter of a thumb of the man, of her husband. I'm assuming they'd seek very small men. That would be the practical thing to do with that law and order. But they just suffered all odds that we did not have today. Plus, they had to wear those outfits and the corsets and the heels and whatnot that were very binding. And of course, they had no rights. They could not own property. They didn't, like you said, they couldn't even own their own children. And the disrespect, and seriously, it was just women and people who were mentally challenged that could not vote at that point. 1913, the Black males got the vote, but still women, all women could not vote at that point. So that's why I wrote it. And what's going on now, you see this push to move backwards and to start to take away the laws and the rights of women. You know, we have to speak up. We have to be part of this journey and rise up on the shoulders of those that came before us.
Right.
Because they sacrificed so much.
Excellent point. And considering what Mary just said, and also your role with the League of Women Voters, what impact did this performance have on you tonight?
Well, I had to wipe away a couple tears, I'm not gonna lie. I've always been a sucker for women's history and the fight for suffrage, and it really was a fight. Because what this really reminded me of is the fact that no one gave women the right to vote. No one gave people of color the right to vote. We took it. People, they fought for it. Ida B. Wells and Catherine McCullough and Grace Wilbur Trout were all fighting in their own way to assure women a right to vote. And we often think of suffrage as ending, that movement ending, as I take care of my cat, in 1920, but it really continued. Like a lot of the people of color who gained that federal right to vote, the women were immediately subjected to these same stringent tests that the men were subjected to after the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendments. So really, like, the fight continued through the Civil Rights Act being passed in 1965 and on into today. So it's really a good reminder of where we came from and where we still need to go.
Very good. Mary, do women of today owe it to our sisters to honor their past struggles? And if so, in what ways do we do this?
I think definitely. I mean, you've had all these people, these women sacrificing their lives, literally, and their careers and their reputations and just their well-being, their sense of well-being. So they were the ones that opened the doors and have continued to open the doors. I mean, it was Fannie Lou Hamer in '65, fighting and trying to open those doors for women to get the right to vote and speaking up. It's just our duty to do that and to remember that we're not there yet. We still don't have ERA, which was Alice Paul introduced in 1923. And we don't have abortion, abortion laws are being threatened. We don't have equal pay. Domestic violence is an all-time height with this virus that's going around. We need more women in decision-making positions so they'll be protected. And we need to have a woman as president, which we have not had yet. And hopefully, not to get too political, but maybe we'll have a BP coming up. And so it's up to us for our future of our children, the future of those little girls, to continue the fight, to continue the struggle, and do the right thing at not that much cost to us, I think, during these days.
And I often think of the right to vote as one of our most important freedoms, as it intends to give us a voice, which we don't always feel that we have. But it's a freedom that comes with a great deal of responsibility. Can you talk a little bit about the responsibilities that come with the right to cast a vote, and also what we should be thinking about now as we are less than 2 weeks away from voting?
Yes, so I will take this opportunity right now to say that if you don't already have it, make your plan to vote. At this point, so many areas around the country have early voting has already begun. If you feel safe voting in person, now is the time to make a plan to go. Be ready to wait in line. Be ready to take some time out of your day. If you prefer to vote by mail, I know in Illinois you have until October 29th to apply for a vote by mail ballot, but don't wait, do it now. And if you already have your vote by mail ballot, turn it in today, either by mailing it in or by dropping it off at one of the drop-off boxes that are now available at every early voting site in Illinois. When I think about the responsibility of the right to vote, this is something that was drilled into me by my mother, who I know is on this Zoom. One of my very first memories was of going to vote with her, and I sat at her feet while she filled out her ballot, and I remember watching her put it into the bin, and then on the way home in the stroller hearing the stories of the suffragettes. And my mom was very clear that this was a fight and that no one gave me this right. It was fought for. And so for me, that responsibility to vote and the knowledge that if this was 1776, I would not have been considered a full citizen has always been something that has spoken to me a lot. So when it comes to like now, the League of Women Voters is obviously a voting rights organization, and we're also a voting information organization. So we hope that, oops, I think someone accidentally shared their screen. We want to make sure that once you have that right to vote, that you're voting informed. And to that end, if you're in Illinois, I recommend taking a look at illinoisvoterguide.org, which is the League of Women Voters of Illinois' official voter education website. If you're in another state, Vote 411 is the League of Women Voters National Voter Education Center. And the best way to make sure that you are fulfilling the hopes and dreams of all these suffragettes from the past and the people who are working today is to make sure that when you're voting, you are voting informed.
Great. That was a very thorough answer. And I've just posted some voting information into the chat if anyone is looking for ways to register now if you haven't registered yet, or information about voting by mail. I can guarantee you that it's very easy to do to get your ballot by mail. And
I forgot to add.
And it's great. They do a tracking system that's excellent.
Yeah, and I forgot to add, if you are planning on voting in person and are worried that your registration is not up to date and you are in Illinois, I have good news for you. And it's that you can register to vote at any early voting site. You just need to be prepared to vote right away. So make sure you're ready to go in, because you will be registered to vote, and then you will immediately be handed your ballot and you will vote. And if you miss that and it's already election day, you just need to figure out what your home precinct is and you can register to vote right there.
That's great information. Thank you. Let's see. So, Mary, can you expand a little bit more on Ida B. Wells' involvement in the fight and what the 19th Amendment meant for Black women when it was passed? There was a lot of tension between some of the women in the play, and these were things that I wasn't aware of. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that too.
Yes, I would like to do that, but I'd like to also cover the history of where Ida B. Wells was coming from and of course the Black community. So we had the abolition of slavery for the 13th Amendment in 1865. And immediately after, they created the Black Codes. And the Black Codes were local and state laws. And what they did was basically take away any voting rights. They controlled travel. They controlled where the Black community lived. They controlled if their children were used for labor purposes. And they basically kept the Black community as indentured servants. Mm-hmm. So it was pretty much business as usual to a degree. And then during Reconstruction, the KKK comes in with their terrorism and keeps them in place. KKK is a theme throughout right before the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So they rear up in 1920s, they rear up again in the 50s, and then the early 60s when the Civil Rights Movement comes in. So that continues on then it moves into what are called the Jim Crow laws, which are basically the Black Codes. And that was forbidding people, and that kind of filtered in around the country. And so Blacks couldn't go into theaters, they couldn't go into restaurants, they couldn't go into bus stations or water fountains, everything was separated. And that continued on, even separate textbooks, even separate prostitutes. Ida B. Wells comes in 1910 on to fight lynching. Lynching reaches its height in 1919. We have the Red Summer with rioting and lynchings. The Black community finally riots against, about 25 of those popped up. And she writes a number of books on this. And she gets, she was a newspaper woman. She did so many things, but she was in Tennessee. So they burned it down. The mob came in, they burned her down and kicked her out. And so she fled north, and it turned out to be a good thing, meeting her husband. And then siding with these women who were already in the process of the vote. And then she established all these clubs, the Alpha Suffrage Club, which was one of the first African-American women's clubs out there. And she was not welcome at the time. And she was, the Black, they were separate. So they did not know each other. They were foreign entities, and there was not trust, certainly, and rightly so. And so, but Ida B. Wells was determined as they come, and she just kept plugging away and got herself in there. And finally, the white women who did want to remain separate, and these are Northern white women, I would say, at that time that she was dealing with Chicago and the greater Illinois Northern area, decided that they had to have the Black women in there to gain the power and go forward. So there was a coming together, a meeting of the minds for the cause. And one thing with this script, it was all about the cause and what they sacrificed. Well, here's Ida sacrificing her dignity half the time, working with people she certainly doesn't particularly want to, and that who have killed her relatives and, burned out her people. And here she is working hand in hand with them for the cause, for that right to vote. She knew how important that was, and she would do anything to get it. And so it continued. Even they got the vote. The Northern Black women were allowed to vote. Ida B. Wells voted once that 1920 thing was passed, but the women in the South did not. So they had all those laws in place that could keep them down, that could keep them away from the polls, to keep the businesses segregated. And that continued on through World War II. Even though they fought the Black men fought in World War II, when they came out, they weren't allowed to get mortgages, jobs weren't available, they were met with violence. And it wasn't until really 54, the Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education, and they struck down segregation was unconstitutional in the schools. So that was the very beginning. And then in 64, the Civil Rights Act was passed. And that struck down those Jim Crow laws, but that wasn't until 1964. And then in 65, the Voting Rights Act was passed that allowed minorities to vote unhindered by all these barriers they pull up. And that's where you run into Fannie Lou Hamer, speaking up at that time period. But it was on the shoulders of Ida B. Wells and Sojourner Truth. And still, I want to say now, there is so much going on to stop folks from voting, and particularly those in the minority. And right. Voter suppression is disgusting. Right. But that's their struggle, and they were profoundly tough and rugged to get there and determined.
Great. Thank you for that answer. It's a very, very complex issues, but a very comprehensive answer. Thank you. Thank you. And building on that, Mary mentioned the struggles that are going on today. What struggles do voters, particularly in the Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, face?
Right. So I would like to preface this statement by being like, everyone can see me. So I'm very white, just to acknowledge that. But yes, particularly people of color, have a lot of voter suppression. Much of this goes back to a few years ago when they struck down key provisions of that 1965 Voting Rights Act, which then allowed counties that historically had been voter suppressors to change how they did their elections without getting permission from the federal government. That was a big deal. So when we see things like people in Milwaukee waiting 7 hours to vote because a lot of the polling places have been closed down. I believe Louisville, Kentucky, during their primary had one voting place. So when we see this happening, to some extent, it's great because all these people want to be involved. But a lot of those polling places that we see getting closed down because there's not enough workers happen in Black and Brown communities. So when we look at the implications of changing times, a lot of the things that happen to people of color. Just as a quick example, in many Indigenous communities, reservations don't have roads traditionally the way that a lot of suburban communities or cities would have. And in states that have large Native American populations, you will often see things like your voter ID has to have your street address on it. That's voter suppression, because if you live on a Native American reservation and you don't have a traditional address, you might not then be able to register and vote because they are saying you don't have a street address. This is also how the homeless community is often pushed out of voting as well. So there's a lot of different things. Like, we're pretty lucky in Illinois, all told. There's a lot of different ways that our government has actually worked to allow these communities, but we still see it. Like, there's still, when polling places are closed in Chicago, the south and west sides are the first ones to close. So when we talk about the implications of people of color's votes being suppressed, like, it's very active and it's happening and it's everywhere. It's not just the South, it's the North too.
I'm going to wrap up our question portion with just for both of you, the same question. We're going to be voting in just under 2 weeks, and we'll see the results of our national election. What do you both want to tell voters about voting on November 3rd? What's the most important takeaway you can give them today?
I think I'll go first and then I'll let Anne finish it up. I think for us as women, we are in a very precarious position, and where we are literally being pushed back to the 50s, and our rights are trying to be suppressed and taken away, as are people of minorities and people of color and the gay communities. So it's up to us to create that change, be part of that change, be part of the solution. And it's literally our duty to do it. And I think this election, more than anyone, at least in my lifetime, and I'm older, I've never seen anything like this. So unless it was the 60s and with that, and it's the same energy that needs to be behind creating change.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, I think the most important thing for me as I go into this election is that reminder that my right to vote was not given to me, it was fought for. And when I go into that ballot, that booth, I'm not just voting for myself, I'm voting for everyone who can't vote. When it comes to universal suffrage, obviously it's an ongoing struggle. But those of us who do have the right to vote, it is so important that we utilize it. In a constitutional democracy, the one that we live in, the only surefire way to ensure that those who are elected to represent us actually listen to our voices is to show it at the ballot box. That is one of the most important things that we can do as citizens. And there are so many people who live here who do not have that right yet. And so when you're going in to vote, just remember, it's not just for you. You're voting for yourself, but you're also voting for your neighbor who immigrated and isn't a citizen of the United States yet. You're voting for the person who served their time on a felony sentence and now is out and trying to reintegrate into society. You're voting for your children. You're voting for your grandchildren who are not yet old enough to vote. You're voting for all of us. So, yeah.
Thank you. That's a really good place to end. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thanks to both of you for participating. Now I'm going to go through the chat box, and if you're up for it, a few more questions, ladies. First, I'm going to start. There is quite a few kudos and congratulations. I just want to go ahead and read those to you too, because that's important after that wonderful play and our discussion. Amy says, kudos to all of you. Susie says, wonderful, congratulations all. Stacy says, she's a young widow woman with 4 little girls, and this is very close to her heart. Thank you and bravo. Let's see. Yes. Oh, I've seen this several times already, says Joni. It gets better each time. And Julie says, excellent presentation. Great job, Mary. Your work is always stellar and thorough. All right. We've got one question here. Let me go back and find it. Chris says, question for Anne Jamieson. Where do you feel the most progress has been made with respect to voting rights? And what, in your opinion, is the biggest current obstacle that the voting rights movement faces?
Wow, it's a great question. So right now, I would say the biggest progress I've seen is the expansion of early voting. I moved from Michigan when I was 22, and I came here for graduate school and have stayed ever since. And at the time I moved from Michigan, you had to vote on election day, or you had to have a reason to ask for an absentee ballot. And in the 2018 election, that was something that the voters of Michigan passed, was early voting and no reason absentee ballots. So the progress and the fact that I think, and I could be wrong because I'm not looking up this stat right now, but about 36-ish states in the union now have early voting, which I think is fantastic. I am all about making it easier to vote. As far as obstacles that the voting rights movement still faces, there is still some obstinance to the fact that especially Black and Brown communities face these different voter suppression tactics. And it's everything from social media posts designed to deter African Americans from coming out and voting, which is something that we saw in 2016 and has been happening again in 2020. It's closing down of polling places. It's prevent adding in voter ID laws that make it harder to vote. And the easiest way to do something about it, because it's like when you hear this, you're like, oh, it's really hard to think about how you can make a difference. And the easiest way to make a difference is to get involved. Start talking to your representatives. Something as easy as sending an email to the people who represent you, because they were elected to represent your interests. So they should be paying attention to what you say to them. When it comes to the closing down of polling places, it's a little late this year, but next election cycle, consider becoming an election judge, because part of the rationale behind closing down polling places was there aren't enough people to be an election judge. So consider volunteering your time in a nonpartisan way on election day, working those polls. I can tell you, I'm really excited to do it. I'm going to be an election judge this election day, and it's going to be a long day, but I'm really psyched to watch everyone come in and vote. So just find ways to get involved. The League of Women Voters is always looking for people who are excited to work for voting rights. So if you head to lwv.org and search by your zip code, you can find your local league.
Okay, great. And I put the contact information for the League of Women Voters in the chat too. So if people want to scroll up and find that, they can. I've got just a couple more questions here. What are some ways the League of Women Voters of Chicago is using its might to support the right to vote?
So we have been obviously super involved in voter registration. COVID has kind of put a halt to our in-person progress, but we're very lucky in Illinois that we can register to vote online. So we have been pushing that in virtual settings, much like this. We also work with, so the League of Women Voters has different levels. Mm-hmm. So at the county level, the League of Women Voters of Cook County has been instrumental in ensuring that people who are in Cook County jails but are not yet convicted of a felony or of any charge have their right to vote maintained. So they've been extremely instrumental in ensuring that Cook County Jail is a polling place. At the state level, obviously we work across the state to ensure polling places are open. We're big into like volunteering as election judges and poll watchers. So we kind of just flood the streets basically.
Okay, great. Someone is asking in the chat now, and maybe you addressed it, part of it, but they're asking, do the former felons have to have all their restitution fees paid?
So let me double check real quick, because I have a piece of information that will tell me the answer to this. And as a librarian, I don't want to just spout off about rights to vote. Yeah. So according to Illinois Legal Aid, which is a really great organization, and it provides free legal information for people in Illinois, like it sounds like, once you have completed your sentence and you are no longer in the custody of the Illinois Department of Corrections, your right to vote is automatically restored in Illinois. You don't have to have paid all your fees. You just have to no longer be in jail. You will have to re-register. So if you know anyone who has recently been released from prison, they will have to make sure they are re-registered to vote. But yes, once you are done with your sentence in Illinois, you are good to vote again.
That's great. That's great. Thank you very much. Thanks for that. I'm going to wrap them here and we can start letting people in, but just give me a second here to thank everybody on behalf of the Friends of the Edgewater Library and the Edgewater Branch Library and our audience tonight. I want to thank Mary, the performers, and Anne Jamieson for an educational and thought-provoking evening. I hope we were all inspired tonight by these lessons of the past and wise words about our present to go out and exercise this most important right to vote between now and November 3. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having us.
All right, we're going to start letting everybody in now.
Thank you, Jane.